All right, so this is the neutral theory lecture, and unfortunately neutral theory is a really confusing idea in ecology that's relatively new, maybe only maybe 10 to 15 years old, really, and it needs a discussion first about niche theory before we can talk about neutral theory. So I want to use the definition of the Altonian definition of niche, where each species has a unique place in the environment. Now that the Hutchinsonian niche is looking at that n-dimensional hypervolume where we can define where a species lives based on these different variables of where it can be. But that's not what I really want to talk about. I want to talk about each species having its unique place. So plovers are these little birds that look for stuff in sand, look for little invertebrates that they're eating in the sand. And oyster catchers are these birds that live or forage a little closer to the water. And avocets are, deeper, and ducks are even deeper, and flamingos are even deeper. And we can see how there's different niches based on the morphology of these different birds that allow them to eat different things. Now, what we see then is this niche differentiation, these character displacements, where we have, in some senses, the bill length, right? The bill is not very long on a plover. It's longer on these oyster catchers and the avocets. The ducks then have a wholly different way of eating things, and flamingos themselves with their extremely long necks and long legs, right? But what we see is that from an Altonian viewpoint of niche, what drives the coexistence is that this adaptive radiation and different speciation that we find in different species to allow for different niches that different species then can inhabit. So what we see is there's a lot of trade-offs then in these different niches, right? So let's think about, a flamingo. The fact that the flamingo has this really long neck and these long legs make it good for foraging in deep water, but it makes it really crappy foraging in the sand, right? These ducks that have this, this mallard duck here that has this diving ability to get down in relatively deep water, again, makes it really crappy to, that there's an extent of, it can only go on water that deep, but then it also is not good on land because it needs to, all of its adaptations don't work for there. So there's a lot of different types of trade-offs that we can see between all sorts of different, like if you're a good competitor, oftentimes you're a bad colonizer. And there's dispersal and fecundity, intolerance and fecundity, activity level and mortality risk. So a species that is more active is probably going to get predated upon more easily. But a species that's less active and doesn't forage as often gets less food, but doesn't get eaten as much. So from just even a niche partitioning perspective, where we have, the green niche here, the species that has the green niche, it is good at nitrogen levels from here to here and water levels from here to here, and it's fundamentally bad in all of this area. So the niche perspective kind of brings about these trade-offs very easily. So one trade-off that's relatively easy to see is has to do with fugitive species, okay, where we have this competition versus colonizing a trade-off, where we see that inferior competitors are oftentimes really good at colonizing things. And then there's these fugitive species. So think about a dandelion. A dandelion can produce, thousands of seeds per plant, and those seeds can be carried up on the wind to all sorts of different places. The thing is, when it lands, that tiny little seed has essentially no energy, so it better land in a damn good spot, otherwise it's not going to do anything. So, where do we find these dandelions growing very well is where they don't have to compete. Because think about a nice, well-kept lawn that has, nice grass, thick grass. That seed lands, gets blown into, and hits the ground in that grass, but it gets choked out for nutrients and sunlight right away. Another example is this. This is a Corixid. It's a water boatman. It's just, a very tiny macroinvertebrate, aquatic macroinvertebrate that kind of has these really high fecundity, it lives as an adult underwater, but as an adult it can also fly pretty much whenever it wants. So they can disperse very long distances, and in fact in my playa wetlands, they're some of the first colonizing insects that you find. And we see these fugitive species have these really quick life cycles, but they're really bad at competing. And what this competition colonization trade-off kind of does is it's an idea to think about that allows for coexistence. Okay, so you can think about a big space, a big field where there's a bunch of different, let's say, cells in this field, right? And you can have one individual per area. Now, if the cell, something dies in this cell, and if the dandelion that's growing right here, I'll put a D here, can get to this spot here and survive, and if that seed can fly there and germinate, it can survive there for a little bit of time before something else comes in and completely outcompetes it. But in that time, something dies over here, and then the dandelion can disperse to here. So it's kind of like a game of hide and seek or cat and mouse, where the dandelion never will win a competition, but because it's so much better at going around to different places, you can get coexistence that way. And if you have a competitive hierarchy, then it allows for multiple coexistence. So if you have, species that are at different levels of competitive ability, you can have all different species existing at the same time. So one way we can see this has to do with seed size versus seed number. So the example of the biggest seeds are coconuts. This is the coconut seed. The coconut that we eat is the seed that we're eating, and those are huge, right? Compared to something like a dandelion seed. So small seeded species travel further, and they're produced more often, or just more of them are produced, right? Because if you have a certain amount of energy, you can put, and if you have the same species or two different species putting the same amount of energy, the smaller those seeds are, the more you'll be able to produce. So that's good for colonization, but it's really bad for competition. So larger seeded species have a higher germination rate. Think of like an acorn, and they have higher survival, right? So it's essentially, a really big seed has a whole lot of nutrients that can then be to help the plant for a long time before it has to live life on its own. The question is, does this trade-off actually exist? And there's plenty of examples of right here, this is reed canary grass, and this is a great example of it has super tiny seeds, but it's a great competitor, and it's really good at colonizing and really good at competing. So there's plenty of examples of species that don't really fit within this certain trade-off. So, but what we can see is, if we think about this niche definition, if each species has its unique place in the environment, that means that you can have coexistence because every single species is different. And that, I think, makes logical sense. Now, what I'm going to throw at you at neutral theory kind of doesn't make logical sense at first. But it's a different way of viewing the world and a different way of viewing ecology. So, neutral theory is saying, what if niches didn't exist? What if every single species was identical? And specifically what we mean by that is birth rates, death rates, and dispersal rates. So, yes, we know species are different. But for right now, let's just think about them as not. Let's just give the species numbers, or species 1, 2, 3, and 4, and they're all the same. They all act exactly the same. Now, this neutral theory was developed from looking at the rainforest trees. In big, expansive rainforests, you have hundreds of species of trees in a relatively small area. And it's kind of hard to think of the Altonian niche of all of these species, of 300 species on, in just a couple hectares. How can you have an individual niche where one species is expected to do better there when you have so many different species? So the thing about the neutral theory is that it explains coexistence based on random population fluctuations. Okay, basically, you have throw a bunch of species randomly on like a checkerboard, and as one species goes up, potentially another species goes down, and it's just random population fluctuations that can drive coexistence. And if given a big enough space, this might actually seem plausible. The thing is, this is a model of the world to explain a pattern and not necessarily a reality, which we'll talk about here in a second. So what is this neutral theory assumptions? Think about a given area with a number of individuals inhabiting it. Okay, so let's say that this is the cover of the Hubble's Unified Neutral Theory of Biodiversity and Biogeography, and so he's got some trees here. Let's say this is our area here. Okay, and the number of individuals in this area is constant. It doesn't change. Think of it as like a full community. And if we were having that cell idea of different cells, and you can think about maybe like one tree per checkerboard area here. Now, space is then that limiting resource, and it's zero sum, meaning there's like a community level carrying capacity. In this case, what do I have? 4 by 4. There's 16 cells here. So if you have 8 of one species and 4 of the other, increasing up to 9 individuals by definition means you'd have to decrease to 3 individuals in the other one. So gains in one equal decreases in the other. So neutral theory is that all individuals have equal probability of colonizing an open space, right? So, everything is colonizing equally, but so if you have then a death in one of these cells, the colonization the colonization of that cell is really only driven by the species' relative abundance. So, in this cell, if you had 8 out of, so we had 15, right? So 8 out of 15 and 7 out of 15 for species 1, and this is for species 2. It would be a slightly higher probability that this empty cell now would get colonized by species 1, because there were 16 squares, so now there's 15, and there were 8 of species 1. So a little higher probability that this would get colonized by species 1. And then death is a constant and fixed rate in the community, right? So whether that is from old age or from storms coming in and wiping out some of these things, it's a constant and fixed rate. And again, remember that all individuals are the same. So we're literally saying here that a frog is completely equivalent to a monkey. And we know that that's not the case, but for a little bit, just kind of go with me here. So what are the implications of this? So let's look at this little diagram down here, right? So you have a death here in this little Christmas tree here. We have an open space now, okay? Well, and then we get a birth where this species, a seed from this tree comes over into this empty space and grows. Or it could be an immigration from a new area coming into this scenario. So then you kind of basically repeat it, where you get now a death over here, and you might get an immigration from the meta community, and over time, what we see here is what is expected to happen is that it's a random walk to a single species dominance. So in the short term, you get coexistence of species just due to random fluctuations in the population numbers. But this actually does a really good job of explaining these really big, it does a really good job of explaining tree abundances in forests, in tropical rainforests, or places where you have really high diversity and not a lot of difference between different areas. The thing is, the long-term implications of this is you have a random walk to a single species dominance. Now, given enough time, these random fluctuations, so in this little scenario here, there's only 2 of these like little palm trees, right? Now, given enough time, it could happen that these 2 species, that those 2 individuals die out. So what we're left with here are these light green palm trees, this red tree, and the Christmas tree, right? And then it could be possible that this one dies, and this one dies, and this one dies, and we eventually then start losing species until we get a single species dominant. The thing is, this, given a big enough area, big enough enough individuals, this is going to take a really, really long time, especially when we're talking about like trees here, where death rate is pretty low. And what's actually expected then with this neutral theory is that if that time is long enough, the speciation of new species can actually offset that. So yes, some species might go extinct, but you might get a speciation event where you bring in a new species, and then that can like reset the whole system such that then you're essentially never get to this single species dominance because you have new species coming in all the time. So when we think about the neutral theory in a meta-community context, the meta-community itself is going to provide species from the region into this space here, this space we have right here. The meta community can provide species to that, and so you might have local species losses, and that's true in a small, maybe a portion of this area. You might this might become only the little Christmas trees, right? But eventually, through meta-community interactions, we would expect new species to come in there. And so when we think about then this neutral theory in a meta-community and a long time frame, we see the number of species in the meta-community is the stochastic balance between the extinction of the global extinction and the global speciation in the whole region, basically. So a meta community could lose species due to just random fluctuations in population, but over time we would expect new species to come in. So I want to digress here a little bit to think about, is neutral theory what is actually happening, right? So, and the way I want to make an analogy here is between Newton and Einstein. So Newton thought about gravity and was the first person to basically give us predictions of how gravity worked. And Newton thought about, masses having an attractive force. So the bigger the mass, Earth here is a huge mass, right? So Earth is a big mass, and it attracts the moon to it, and then the moon spins around the Earth because it's attracted to the moon is attracted to the Earth. And any mass can pull other things together. Now, what we find out is Newton was actually wrong. Newton was very accurate in defining the pattern. So we can actually still use Newton's laws of gravity to launch a rocket to the moon, to Mars, right? But at bigger time scales and at bigger scales, we find that that isn't the case. And Einstein was the first person to think about a mechanism behind gravity. And his idea was that a mass of Earth, well, any mass actually warps space-time itself. Okay, and now this is, physics, but so something moving through space then follows the curvature of space. So the reason then that the moon spins around the Earth is that it's like a one of those coin drain things that you see where the coin spins down the drain, but it's essentially just stuck in a forever loop around Earth because of the way that space is curved. So what Newton did was he saw a pattern, okay, but he had no mechanism. Whereas Einstein, we already knew the pattern, right? We already could predict what happens with gravity, but he made a mechanism. So how does this relate to neutral theory and niche theory, right? So neutral theory, I think, does a good job of, is probably somewhere more on the Newton side, where it shows us a pattern, but doesn't necessarily give us a mechanism, or at least we know that mechanism is assuredly wrong, right? So a lot of people have explained neutral theory as like a way to explain the patterns in ecology by throwing away the entire science of ecology itself, right? So, basically this whole semester we've been talking about how niches and how organisms interact with each other and how their different interactions cause different things. Well, all of that goes away when we think about neutral theory, or if we're thinking in neutral theory kind of terms. So I think what neutral theory does is it shows us a pattern without necessarily a mechanism. Now, that's not necessarily a problem because, um, go back here. Newton is really useful. Newton's ideas and Newton's equations can get us to the moon. But it's still not showing us the true nature of reality. Now, Einstein's equations also get us to the moon, but they're, Newton can be understood by high school physics students. Einstein probably cannot. So, this idea is, if communities are actually behaving in this way, on the surface, this idea that traits don't matter is probably true in some senses, where we might be able to see that demographic stochasticity, random fluctuations in species becoming more common or less common, probably does drive communities in a meaningful way. And neutral theory predicts lots of things. It shows a lot of patterns of the species area curves, right? So, as we have more area, and this is number of species, right? We get this increase, right? Neutral theory does a really good job of explaining that, but essentially so do other models too. What neutral theory doesn't do is predict species turnover times well. So if we go back to this idea here, where we look at the speciation in a tropical rainforest or something, it doesn't. Given the math, we can actually figure out how long we expect species to be around for, and what we see is that it doesn't do that very well. So we know there's a problem with neutral theory. Essentially, it puts the age of angiosperms, of like the age of a rainforest, and the species in a rainforest, before the origination of angiosperms. So either going backwards in time or looking, through time, we know that these turnover times are not correct. So is there value in talking about neutral theory? Is there value in thinking about, this spatially explicit model that shows how species are changing, or has an insight into how species are changing? And I think it's important to, if use it as at least as a starting point. Okay, so if you're thinking about, all these trees in this rainforest here, this is a large task to try to figure out how all these different species are surviving in this place. And I think it's not it's not like there is neutral theory working in tropical rainforests and niche interactions working in a different type of forest. There's probably some sort of continuum of an individual ecosystem interacts more neutrally, or in sometimes in this place, and in another place it has more to do with niche interactions. And I think they can work at the same time, and so it's not like we should just never think about this neutral theory, because it is an important way for us to get insight into how many communities and communities are working. And the thing is, this is one of the full name of neutral theory is the unified. Well, I should just look at it on the book. I can never remember it. The Unified Neutral Theory of Biodiversity and Biogeography. So what it's doing is it's linking local ecology, evolutionary biology, and biogeographic ecology all together. And it does successfully in some ways, not so successfully in other ways, but that's okay because it's a way to look at the world. Alright, that's it for spatial ecology, and with that, I'll see you later.